Hello and good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you're located. Welcome to the Value of Hospice, Better Care, Lower Cost webinar brought to you by the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization and the National Association for Home Care and Hospice. I am Carrie Hoover, NHPCO's Vice President of Education and Events, and I will serve as the webinar facilitator. My colleague, NHPCO's Sarah Bao, Director of Education, is also supporting this webinar. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. Let's review a few logistics before we begin. During the presentation, your audio line has been muted to reduce background noise. You will not be able to unmute your line. If you need technical assistance, please chat with the host at the bottom of your screen. Today's faculty will be addressing questions at the end of the webinar. If you have questions, you may enter them into the Q&A or chat box on your screen anytime during the presentation. The chat feature is open for attendee communication as well. Our webinar will begin with a review of the research findings, then will flow into a facilitated Q&A and conclude with questions from the audience. And now, I'm delighted to introduce our faculty for today. From the National Association for Home Care and Hospice, welcome to William Dombey, President, and Davis Baird, Director of Government Affairs for Hospice. From the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, we have Ben Marcantoni, our interim CEO, and Judy Lundperson, Vice President of Regulatory and Compliance. For more information about our faculty, please visit the webinar website. Ben, Bill, I'll turn things over to you now.
Well, thank you, Carrie, and thank you all for joining us today. We're going to take you through a journey that began several months ago in a joint project between NHPCO and NAC to examine the value of hospice. And why have we ventured down that path? Well, it's pretty clear that hospice is a growing benefit. We are now seeing utilization that is nearly doubled over the last 10 to 12 years, now rising to over 1.7 million patients that are served on an annual basis. 1 out of every 2 Medicare beneficiaries that dies in a year has used hospice services. That's a remarkable change since the beginning of the benefit in the 1980s. But corresponding with that is the spending increase, rising from $13 billion to $23 billion. So the study, doesn't give us that information. We had that already, but the study is there to help us with our continued policy efforts, our advocacy efforts on your behalf, because we have put ourselves into the spotlight in Washington, D.C. The acronym MedPAC may not have been very familiar to many hospices until recently, but now MedPAC is focused on at the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, making recommendations to cut hospice services. And the Inspector General's office and CMS both bringing increased oversight to hospice services, auditing claims, examining quality of care services. And so we felt when coming together for this joint project, the best thing we could do to be advocates for hospice services is to bring out the best of hospice, the value that hospice services brings to people all across the country, but also the value it brings to the Medicare program itself. And it helps us with the education of policymakers on that dynamic value that hospice brings, saving Medicare dollars while providing just incredible care to people at the end of life. So I'll pass it on to my good friend Ben for further discussion on the why.
Thank you, Bill. An important part of the why too is to have good, reliable information and data. And so we agreed that we would really want to work with a well-respected research organization to help us get to the right information that really informs us and the community at large and our legislators and our administration about what the value of hospice is, and to do that in as objective a way as possible. So we did an agreement with NORC, which is based at the University of Chicago, a very, again, well-respected research organization that always takes approach to their research in a very nonpartisan, non-biased way to get to the truth of the outcomes that any organization working with them is looking for. And so with that, they did an excellent job of looking at the population and the beneficiaries of Medicare in a very, very detailed way, so that we really had an apples to apples comparison between hospice utilization, so those beneficiaries who used hospice, and those that did not in their journey of serious illness and end of life. And you're going to hear more detail around that in a couple of slides from now. But just to know that that main differentiator there that they looked at was based on data from the claims of beneficiaries of Medicare recipients, and that they brought that forward and looked at it, applying things like frailty index and such, so that we could really look at the comparison between those who did use hospice and those that didn't, what the financial impact of that was, and what the satisfaction outcomes of that were in terms of qualitative data as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Davis.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk for the next couple of slides a little bit more about the research approach, sort of the methodology that NORC took when they were designing this study, because it's really important to understand the approach that they took, because it does differentiate this analysis from others that have been done in the past. So to start, basically, as Ben mentioned, NORC compared Medicare total costs of care in the last year of someone's life for hospice users versus beneficiaries that did not use hospice at all. They used 2019 data. This is the most recent available data that was not impacted by some of the craziness around COVID, and the pandemic, of course, had a lot of sort of anomalous effects on the healthcare system. So 2019 is good, clean data for us. And just a few sort of methodology elements on this slide that I want to call out that make this analysis, as it says here on the slide, one of the most statistically grounded assessments of hospice to date. So first, you can see this 2.3 million number here. NORC started with the full data set of all Medicare beneficiaries that died in 2019, which they then subsequently narrowed down into the hospice users versus the non-hospice users for their primary analysis. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But again, the sheer size of this sample is notable. Again, starting with that full set of all Medicare decedents in 2019. Perfect. So also, unlike some studies in the past, NORC analyzed 100% of all fee-for-service Medicare claims, all encounter and all enrollment data for 2019. So they really had the entire universe of spending and utilization data to look at. And again, they were examining all Medicare spending in the last year of someone's life. And then finally, perfect. In addition to controlling for a number of sort of standard variables that are par for the course in analysis like this, things like the age of the beneficiary, the sex of the beneficiary, the number of chronic conditions, and Ben just alluded to this in his remarks, the NORC researchers also used a relatively new but still highly validated frailty index when they were building out the study populations and risk adjusting them. This really just means that they applied this frailty index to the primary analysis group to ensure, to use Ben's phrase, that we were comparing apples to apples. That's a notoriously difficult research task to do in hospice. And it's really important because it strengthens the findings, since it means that the hospice users compared to the non-hospice users were very much alike in terms of a number of conditions and variables, including their frailty outlooks. Next slide, please. So I promise this is the last methodology slide, then we're going to dive into the findings. But as I said before, it's important to understand the approach because it really does differentiate the NORC analysis from previous ones. So on this slide, you're going to see sort of in the shape of this funnel here, some of that study population narrowing I mentioned on the last slide. So from that 2.3 million number of all Medicare beneficiaries who died in 2019, the primary analysis was performed on almost 960,000 fee-for-service beneficiaries. You can see here in the second tier split between over 500,000 hospice users compared to 460,000 non-hospice users. Now, the matching process, we hit on this, that NORC used to create this comparison group, extremely robust. Just to hammer it again, it's a super important point because it allows us to say much more definitively that the cost findings in the results are indeed due to hospice utilization and not some other confounding variables. So keep that in mind as we go throughout this presentation. Further breakdown of the population was developed. You don't see it on the slide here, but we did break down the categories by end-of-life disease group. These groups match up with how MedPAC categorizes hospice users. Quickly, those groups were patients with cancer diagnoses, neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disorder, circulatory diseases, respiratory diseases, and finally, chronic kidney disease or end-stage renal disease. There was also a final catch-all, quote-unquote, other category for beneficiaries that did not have one of those conditions from the 5 buckets I just mentioned. Then finally, as we mentioned, the primary comparison was on total Medicare cost of care in the last year of life. And that spending breakdown was further differentiated by the disease categories I just referenced, the 5 groups, and also broken down by various lengths of stay on the hospice benefit. And we'll go into more detail there, but basically chunked out if you were on hospice for 0 to 15 days, 15 to 31 days, 31 to 60, and so on and so forth. We broke down the spending by those 2 categories. So that's the setup, that's the frame up. I'm going to turn it over now to Judy to kick off our overview on the key findings.
Great. Thank you so much, Davis. It is really an exciting set of findings. So let's just jump right in and look at the first finding that the study found. You know, and I always love to talk a little bit about kind of the group of the team members from both NAC and NHPCO that worked on this with NORC, and we were very, very interested in what the findings would be. So we started out with the researchers saying, okay, the hospice users' total cost was 3.1% lower. And I think around the room at that particular meeting, we were all sort of deflated and said, 3.1 is just not much. And then we said, okay, tell us what the dollar amount is. And we get to $3.5 billion less in Medicare outlays in 2019. This is a 1-year amount. So very exciting to see those kinds of numbers in this research. Let's look at what we say next about that 3.1%. So another funnel, we're looking at the 3.1% or $3.5 billion, and also looking at kind of what part of end-of-life spending was hospice, and it's 18.7%. So this is a NORC extrapolation when we get to the 3.5 billion, but that gives you a sense of what we've been looking at. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide. So this particular slide we call our Christmas tree slide, and maybe it had something to do with we were looking at this over the holidays, or it's just that's what it is. And I think just to kind of walk through this carefully, what we did was that very second column in the gray column is no hospice days, and the cost for the care in the last 12 months of life. Sorry, for that group of patients that had no hospice. Then we go to the 0 to 14 days, which is certainly that category there with the red boxes. And we find in that that some of the disease categories were not showing savings, but rather showing excess spending over savings for that first 15 days. So all except for respiratory, which even at the very beginning of care, that 15-day was still a savings. Just one moment. And then we go out from there with all the different length of stay categories, as Davis was referring to. The one I most love to talk about is the greater than 266 days, where you can see savings from that length of stay compared to no hospice days, and even neurodegenerative, still a savings of 4%. In the full document, the executive summary, which is on both the NAC and the NHPCO websites, we have the details of what the numbers look like. But I think for this purpose today, you can see that savings across the length of stay is quite remarkable and even shows savings for the very longest group of length of stay. Let's look at the next slide. So here we have 90% of hospice days. Hospice spending is less than half of the total cost of care. Just also another really terrific and remarkable slide. So Davis, let's keep on talking about this.
Sure. So thank you so much, Judy. And we can populate the graphic here. Yep, there's probably a bunch. There you go, perfect. So as Judy said, we're going to talk a little bit more about the specific interplay between hospice spending and non-hospice spending. But as you saw on that last slide, the key sort of takeaway here, one of the key takeaways is that for 90% of all hospice stays, so the vast majority of all hospice stays in the last year of someone's life, the spending in that final 12 months that is due to hospice amounts to less than half of their total overall cost of care. Now, that's really important because it shows that, again, for the vast majority of hospice users, it's not actually the spending on hospice that's driving their last year of life costs, whether they're high, low, or in the middle, or wherever they are. It's really the interventions that they're getting before they get onto hospice that, for the most part, are resulting in the increased cost. So you can see here on this slide, this is a busy slide, I know, there's a lot happening, and this is an important visualization, though, of what I was just talking about. So let's take a few minutes to walk through here. Now, the solid black bar on the left represents the non-hospice users, the comparison group's average total cost of care, their last year of life. You can see above each of the bars, there's a dollar figure. So for the non-hospice users, that total cost of care is $67,192. Now, each of the other bars represent the average total cost of care for our primary group, the hospice users. And it's broken down, each bar is broken down by their length of stay bucket. So you can see we've got a bar for people who are at hospice 15 days or less, 15 to 30, 31 and 60, and so on as you move right across the table, all the way up on the very far right to those very long stays of 266 plus days on hospice. Then below the bar graph here, you can see in that small table, it's got mostly green and one red square. That's the corresponding spending comparison percentages for each of those length of stay buckets compared to someone who did not get hospice. So that's the setup. A few key takeaways here, and Judy alluded to this, but the first being that almost across the board, hospice users have lower total cost of care in the last year of life than non-hospice users. The only exception to that truth is the first bar there for patients who are on hospice for 15 days or less. Judy hit on that a little bit. And the only reason that we know that this group's spending in the last year of life is higher than non-hospice users is simply because they had so much non-hospice care, non-hospice services done to them in the last 12 months of their life. And they were on hospice for such a short period of time that the hospice model of care just did not have enough time to really, or opportunity to defer those expensive treatments or interventions that happen in the last year of life, right? It would be emergency department visits, hospitalizations, and so on. But except for that under 15 cohort, for all others, the total cost of care for people who used hospice is less than the comparison group. And importantly, in the aggregate, it's the spending that occurs when someone is not on hospice at all that accounts for the bulk of costs in the last 12 months of their life. So that's one really important takeaway. The other important thing to pay attention to here is the split within each of the bars themselves. So you can see it's broken up here by blue, orange, and gray sections in the bar. So blue is spending that is specific to the hospice benefit. Orange is spending on services that someone got while they were on hospice, but that are not part of the Medicare hospice benefit. This is what we in our field refer to as unrelated service spend. NORC called it non-hospice concurrent. It's the same thing, just a different nomenclature. So this could be stuff like, a doctor visit for an issue that's not related to their terminal condition or related conditions. Maybe they fell, they needed some treatment for that, something along those lines. And then finally, the gray section is spending that occurred when the person wasn't on hospice at all. And you can see here, you can visualize as you go across the graph, and as someone's stay on hospice makes up a larger share of their last year of life as those length of stays increase, spending on hospice services make up a greater share of that total last year of life spending. That makes intuitive sense, right? The longer you're on hospice, the greater proportion of it, that's making up the last year of your life, the more spending it's going to contribute to. But what is key is that even when hospice makes up almost 90% of someone's spending in their last year, that's the very last bar on the right, their total cost of care is still 12% lower than someone who didn't get hospice at all. So this graph is really important. It shows the breakdown between hospice and non-hospice spending within length of stay categories. But at a high level, it really reinforces the dynamic value of hospice across varying lengths of stay. So we can go to the next slide real fast. Thank you so much. This is really just a cleaner and a simpler sort of visualization, hammering home that last point I made. As you can see, as hospice use increases, the top blue bar there, and as the portion of the last year total cost of care that are attributed to hospice increases, the actual aggregate all-in spending across that last year of life decreases. That's that yellow line below the blue one. Again, showing the power of hospice to substitute and prevent those expensive interventions, and not just expensive. I'm sure everyone on this call knows, a lot of times those are unhelpful, burdensome, harmful interventions that don't do a lot of good for a patient and family at this time in their life. So I mentioned ED visits, hospitalizations, we could be talking very costly last line chemotherapies and the like. So again, a really important takeaway that hospice is driving value throughout the length of stay chain. So Judy, why don't you take our next key finding? I think that's going to be something that we've kind of hinted at a little bit in the slide so far.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of those other really incredibly important pieces of information as we're looking at that whole length of stay and how successful hospice has been in saving the Medicare Trust Fund. So we have, the finding is that earlier enrollment in hospice generates more savings. So let's look at the next slide, and we'll talk a bit about how we got to this. So I know many of you who are looking at your own data or looking at state or national data about length of stay, we know that the median length of stay is now 17 days. So that is 50% of our patients have a length of stay of 17 days or less. And when we started looking at that first finding of that less than 15 days, and we had the expenditures increasing over the savings, we said we can't just leave it there. We have to dig deeper. We have to figure out exactly what is happening. So this particular slide has every disease group. And we found that in every disease group, the break-even point was 10 days. So if we said the first 10 days of care of that group of 0 to 15 or 1 to 15, that at day 10, we start to see a turnaround in terms of savings, not expenditures. And as we asked the NORC researchers to take a look at this a little bit more, that kind of first break-even day is different by disease. We didn't include that in these slides here, but if you wanted to see the whole report, that executive summary is on both the NHPCO and the NAC websites for you to take a look at. But what does this mean, and what would we do with this data? Absolutely, it means that we should do as much as we can to get patients into hospice sooner. So if we say the first break-even point is 10 days and 25% of our patients are at 5 days or less, if we could lower that percentage of 5 days or less and add a few more days to patients who are coming to us, this is really going to make a difference in terms of Medicare spending and Medicare savings. So Davis, I'll turn it back over to you to keep on looking at some of our data points.
Awesome. Sounds good. Terrific. Thank you. So, okay, moving on to our next key finding from the analysis here. This is one I think that's really important given what we know from the policy perspective about where all the oversight and audit focus is going in hospice, which often seems to be zeroed in on long hospice lengths of stay. So you can see on the slide here, NORC found that for beneficiaries who were on hospice in the last year of life for 180 days, so 6 months or more, for those beneficiaries, spending was actually lower than comparable individuals who got no hospice at all. Again, driving home that even for those longer hospice stays, they're driving financial value to the Medicare program. Next slide, please. So let's get a little more granular on this finding here. So when looking at these 180-day plus stays, NORC found that across all disease groups, remember I mentioned those 5 disease groups, so across all of those in the aggregate, spending was lower by 11% compared to non-hospice users. And again, we're just focused on people who were on hospice for 6 months or more, what we would consider long lengths of stay. And the spending amount, that's that circled first line there, that circled red line, that's the aggregate 11% reduction in savings for 180-day plus stays on hospice. Now, the spending reduction amount did vary by the specific disease groups. As you can see, that's represented in the different lengths of these green lines here. But importantly, you can see this, for each of them on its own, spending was lower than that for someone who got no hospice at all. So you can see here the longest lines, or the greatest savings for long stays were found for people with kidney diseases, the CKD and ESRD, and respiratory conditions. 20 plus, 25 plus reductions in savings for those disease groups. And if we zero in on the neurodegenerative category here, it's that shortest little line. You can see that the spending reduction is lower than the other disease buckets. It's at 4% below non-hospice users, but that still is a significant reduction. And I call that out because we think it's really important to demonstrate, since we know that there has been a lot of oversight focus on neurological patients in hospice in particular. There have been some out there who would argue that these types of patients, maybe they're not appropriate for hospice, maybe having them on the benefit is just driving up costs to Medicare overall. Now we have data showing that argument about these particular patients, this population, increasing Medicare spending in the aggregate because they're on hospice, that's just not accurate. This data definitively shows that. So even the neurological patients who are on hospice for 6 months or more for that last year of life, they're providing that dynamic cost-saving value to the system writ large, which I think is a really important point to take away from this study. And Judy, I think I'm going to turn it over to you for our last sort of key finding.
Right. So while we've looked at Medicare spending, we've looked at diagnosis groups, we've looked at length of stay, we also looked at how the patient's experience in hospice really impacted their care. And so we started to look at a number of different research studies that talked about the experience of care, how hospice patients rated their care, or how patients' families rated their care. So let's look at the next slide. We can take a look at some of those findings. So we look at families reported patients received just the right of pain medication. They reported more often that the patient's end-of-life wishes were followed. Hospice admission in the last 6 months of life correlated, this is my personal favorite, correlated with increases in patient satisfaction and better pain control and reduction in hospital stays. So you can see all of these are connected to recent research, and the researchers looked at research in the last 5 to 7 years of publications. So this is very current, and you could use any of these in your discussions with the news media in your community, or with members of Congress if you're coming to do, you can't do the NAC March on Washington. It happened in March, but you could do the hospice Action Day and Hospice Action Week in June for NHPCO. So I think these are also very important findings that really, coupled with the work that has been done now on the cost of care and the savings, even when care is longer than 180 days, make this a very important study. Next slide, please. All right, Bill, we're turning it back over to you. You're on mute, Bill.
Yeah, I joked earlier that Judy had control of the mute button, but I had control of it. So my apologies for making the mistake that we've all made for the last 3+ years now.
Absolutely.
You know, the policy implications are important here. I mean, we brought about this study because of the pressures coming from the policy world, from Congress, from regulators, from oversight bodies as well. And then we even looking at it from a policy perspective, you know, where were Medicare Advantage plans going with the VBID demonstration program and where that may be down the line. We actually reached the conclusion that everything we could hope for in this study is there to help us with the policy directions that we need to take. I mean, the implications are quite clear that what we should be working on is how do we increase access to hospice services? How do we ensure people who are on long enough to get the maximum quality of life benefit? That is the paramount part, but also benefits that drive savings to the Medicare program. That's a potent combination in Washington, D.C., when you could both have a service that people just love when they get it, and at the same time, saving the Medicare program money along the way. That doesn't happen too often in the Medicare program. So how do we get there? You know, that gives me a bit of an anecdote. I recently did a show on the National Public Radio that was focused on hospice, and President Jimmy Carter was the triggering point for all of that. And we have to thank he for that great choice that he made, and the choice of being public with his hospice election really will benefit patients well beyond his time on hospice services. But on this show appeared a woman whose husband had died on hospice after 7 days of care under hospice. And she said not once during the course of his treatment with the oncologist for his cancer was hospice ever even referenced. You know, so wasn't even aware adequately of that choice. So where do we go policies wise to increase access to hospice services? Starts with increasing an awareness of the benefits that hospice can bring to the patients. The other is, you know, facing the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission. Typically MedPAC makes recommendations on payment rate cuts or changes that cut spending on the Medicare program. But in this case, the evidence is there that it would be penny wise and pound foolish. You know, cutting the hospice cap has been something in discussion for a long time because it starts with an assumption that long lengths of stays are counter to the interest of the Medicare program's financial stability. In fact, this study demonstrates that wide range of patients within the hospice services, everything from patients with cancer to patients with dementia, can be accommodated with tremendous care while actually saving the Medicare program money. Again, you know, that short-sightedness of looking at long stay patients is automatically a cost to the program. That myth has now been dispelled through this study. And beyond that, the overly intense audit activity focusing on lengths of stays of more than 180 days. Coincidentally, and this is totally coincidentally, a study funded by the National Institutes on Aging that was issued just days after this study was issued established exactly the same points here in terms of policy implications. And they went a little more hardcore on it. And they said, this activity of audits is chilling the healthcare system in terms of when patients are counseled to consider hospice as services. It's scaring people away from hospice because you'll avoid an audit if you avoid these longer stay patients. That's a major policy implication here. You know, again, wasting resources perhaps on claims audit that actually costs the Medicare program money, not just for the audit activity, but for the outcome of scaring people away from choosing hospice when it fits for them. So very important policy implications. And Ben, there are other policy areas that, improving more timely access to care that we should be looking at. And so you've got those, pass them on, please. And you are on mute, Ben. Thank you for making me look less dumb.
Didn't want you to feel alone, Bill.
And I wasn't holding the mute button for Ben either. Yeah. I'm just here to say.
So there are really important further implications and opportunities to have these important findings and outcomes improve people's access to care and really get the care they need when they need it in the place that they need it. So advanced care planning, of course, is one of those places where can be further advanced and better informed by the information that comes out of this study that was done for us with NORC. Being able to really show our colleagues that we work with in the field about the value of entering hospice upstream and actually introducing palliative care, even leading into that. We really also want to make sure that we can pull that thread forward of the learnings that we had with the Medicare Choices model and have this data and these outcomes, use it toward informing the work that we do with the CMMI, the innovations team at Medicare, to look at how can the benefit evolve in an appropriate way, not losing the value of it and the fundamental structure, but how can we make it really work that much better? And some of these outcomes can help really inform that in very important ways. And then really looking at how these any expensive palliative curative interventions and straddling those treatments with any ways they might be a barrier to people choosing them, when hospice could be the most appropriate benefit at the time. So these are all ways in which we can make sure that this data and this information can be brought forward over the long term and inform not only what we're doing and addressing today, but as we do work going forward, will continue to make a difference. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Judy and David.
Great, thank you, Ben. So this slide is really a plug. As Bill and Ben just discussed, part of the impetus for commissioning NORC to look at this was some of the policy pressures on hospice, and they did a great job, incredible math, incredible deep dives on the numbers. And so now we're in the phase where advocacy around the findings is incredibly important. To spread the word, to evangelize, so to speak, about this value of hospice. I think for most people on this line, this is probably not a surprise. I think we've felt, again, intuitively that hospice has been this incredible benefit. It's improved the quality of care, quality of life for patients and families. It saves the system money, but we might not have had this seminal number crunching to back up that latter sort of gut feeling about the financial savings. We have it now. So it's really important that we really get out there and talk about it to our boards, our colleagues, but really also talk about it to our policymakers, our elected officials at the federal level, at the state and local level. Everyone needs to understand, people often have, policymakers often have a personal connection to hospice. They're supportive of it because they've had a good experience in their own life, but they really need to know this dynamic value it brings to the system from a financial perspective too. So that's all to say that we have already kicked off our advocacy efforts around the NORC study. You can see these pictures here. NAC recently held, as Judy alluded to earlier, our annual March on Washington, which is our in-person fly-in lobby day in DC. That took place on 2 weeks ago, March 28th. These pictures are all from that day. We had over 150 Capitol Hill meetings with members of both the House and Senate. And the NORC study was one of our 2 hospice priority, quote, asks or issues. So there was a question I think I saw that came in the chat. Every single office on Capitol Hill, all 500 plus of them, was sent a copy of this study. So they've got it in their inboxes. And again, for all 150 of these meetings, we think for a vast majority of them, NORC was discussed. And I've been getting some feedback already from advocates to say that the staffers or the members they met with were extremely supportive of the research, really appreciated the new financial findings. We are in an environment right now where there is some rhetoric around fiscal austerity and so on and so forth. So having this data now showing the value of hospice to the Medicare program, to savings overall, spending overall, really important. So NAC is absolutely continuing to advocate for and with our policymaking community around the study. And I know that NHPCO, Judy, you might want to talk about an upcoming opportunity that you guys are going to be using to spread the word too.
Absolutely. So we will also be doing our Hospice Action Week June 6th and 7th. And that will be when our advocates come to Washington to visit with members of Congress and to talk to each other. And we also will be doing a lot of our talking points are around this NORC study, very, very important. And I think we're encouraged by what NAC has already done and feel like this is going to be quite an important milestone for members of Congress and their staffs, especially the staffs of the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, to say we really want to dispel that myth that longer stays in hospice really costs the Medicare system money, because that's one of the really most important points of the work that we've done on this.
Let me just add a little bit of context that I think would be valuable, and that is, we are entering into the 2024 presidential campaign and congressional re-election campaign, all across the country. And what's entered into that process already is the Medicare program, because the trustees have indicated that the financial health of the Medicare program is fairly weak at this point in time. And that means people will be focusing in on the Medicare program and how to bring about savings on a going forward basis. And both political parties are pretty careful about any cuts to the Medicare program. So the opportunity here is the best it could possibly be to say, here, hospice is the perfect fit for the future of the Medicare program. It is, it is a godsend, perhaps, that we have this study, and the timing of it could not have been better.
Yeah. And I would just add that, this is an important tool that we want you all to use and to really start, not even having to wait for, the March on Washington and such, but to really use them at the state level and go to the district offices and go to your state legislators as well and bring this information forward, because as Bill mentioned, this is an opportune time with really valuable data and a tool that you can use to inform them. And also, as you work with MA plans and talk with them about the the findings and how the cost savings are reached and the qualitative outcomes that are there, use this in all your conversations with those folks.
Absolutely correct. So I think it's time. Davis has a question he wants to ask Bill, and then I have a question I want to ask Ben. So Davis, go ahead.
Absolutely. Oh, we did just skip over one of the last slides. It's okay though.
Absolutely.
No worries. I think it was up there as we were talking, but I would direct folks to the respective landing pages on each of the NAC and NHPCO websites. We went through a lot of numbers today, some high-level policy stuff. But on the Hospice Works landing pages for each of our organizations on our websites, you'll find a number of additional materials and resources that you can use to do the type of advocacy that Ben was just talking about. There's a summary 2-pager, there's a PowerPoint deck that's a little more streamlined, there's sample media kits, letters to the editor, so a lot of stuff that can get you started on the sort of advocacy journey. And of course, always reach out to us at our organizations for help or questions on any of that. So just an additional plug there. But yeah, so let's kick off the Q&A with just a high level. And we've been talking about this all throughout, but to Ben and Bill, in your own words, What do you think are the 2 or 3 key takeaways from the report? Bill, why don't you go first?
Yeah, for me, one of the key takeaways is that you cannot rely upon assumptions for establishing policy. And too much of what's happened in healthcare policy, and in particular of late with hospice, is that assumption that things like a long length of stay is a bad thing. And many of us maybe have fallen into that assumption ourselves, but here the empirical evidence is strong, it's undeniable. And the lesson learned from that is, we need to find facts rather than rely upon assumptions in getting there. And that our policy should be guided by that deep dive kind of factual understanding of things. And the other aspect, in terms of a takeaway, is you can't always assume that more is bad when it comes to spending on a particular sector. And Davis, you used the word dynamic value, and it's a word that fits perfectly here, that there is an interaction between healthcare services of different types and different sectors, and that you can't look in a silo when examining anything. So yes, we've spent more on hospice services, more days on coverage, but what was the end overall outcome is really what matters for the patient as well as for the financing of the services. So very important lessons to learn from an actual processing standpoint on how we should approach healthcare policy going forward. And if there's a third thing, those parties who advanced the concept of hospice many, many years ago did so with the firm belief, but it was intuitive at that point, that hospice was not just a great thing for patients, but a great thing relative to controlling spending at the end of life. And it's amazing how right an intuitive approach can be. And that was a lesson learned here. Judy, I know you were part of that way back when. So
I was, absolutely.
You get one of those genius awards for that.
Well, and I've been reflecting a lot on that very thing, because I think we struggled in those early days with having to prove that hospice was a cost saver when no other part of Medicare had to prove that they, for their services, were saving the Medicare system money. So I think for all of us that have been around for a long time, including me, I think being able to prove this is really a wonderful thing. So thank you for that, Bill. All right, Ben, it's your turn now. And so I'd like for you to talk to us a bit about how do you think providers should use this research?
Yeah, thank you, Judy. And I in some ways jumped the gun earlier out of my enthusiasm that
all right.
I'll add a little bit more to that, in that, again, using this as a tool in our conversations in advancing understanding of the value. Again, as I know, for not everyone, MA plans and such haven't been a key concern for some of our providers, but it has been for many of our providers. And this, again, is an opportunity to be prepared for those conversations you'll want to and need to have with a whole other payer group that you may not have already had to deal with. And so you can demonstrate a lot of value to those who are still formulating what their benefit is going to look like. And you can help shape that with some of the information here. And then, and the other thing I would share is let's use this also to point to that other end of the spectrum. Bill did a great service to us in articulating that benefit for the long stay. We know that we make a difference for short stay patients, regardless of if it's a couple of hours or a couple of days or a couple of weeks. But we know we can make even more of a difference in their quality of life if they're on longer. But now also we can demonstrate that there will be better savings. We can actually add to the savings to the Medicare program if we bring people on sooner, so that crunch, the beginning of the stay, doesn't happen and we can have it be less costly than it currently is. So those would be a couple things that I would add to what we can do to use this information and educate others and shape the formation of the benefit going forward.
Absolutely. And I think just underlining 5 times that even at 266 days or more, there is still savings. So
Right.
Very, very good points, Ben. So thank you for that. I think we're going to move now into questions and answers. And you have the opportunity. There are 2 buttons at the bottom of your screen, one for Q&A and one for chat. And so we will look at some of the questions that have come in, and I'll see if I can figure out which one of us can answer the question. So stand by. First question, the report shows that patients with cancer diagnoses require more funding utilizing the hospice benefit if they have a short length of stay. I find in my hospice that cancer patients with a short length of stay usually require GIP, or general inpatient services for acute symptom management, and typically follows a hospitalization. For many of these patients, their options are not to go home with routine home care, but rather stay in the hospital for aggressive care or come to a hospice unit for acute symptom management. It is safe to say that remaining in the hospital would cost considerably more than hospice. How is this factored into the cost analysis in the report for the short length of stay for cancer patients? And Davis, I bet that you have some ideas on how to answer this question.
Sure, that was, I got lost there in the twists and turns, but I think I got the nut of it. So the short answer is yes, that situation is captured by the analysis that NORC did. So we weren't just looking at routine home care or any single level of care for hospice in a silo. This was looking at all hospice utilization across levels of care. So for the cancer patients that this person is asking about that may be in that short length of stay bucket, and cancer had that shortest length of stay, they're often in pretty bad shape coming from the hospital and so on. The analysis did account for that. And as I'm thinking about how the question was phrased, it tracks with what we found too, which is right. Except for that first tranche of 0 to 15 days, everything else, every other length of stay bucket saved the hospice, saved the Medicare program money, but not that first 0 to 15 days. And it could be that within that 0 to 15 days, these cancer patients who are very sick, very close to death, are getting GIP that would be captured in their hospice spend, but it's very likely that across their last year of life overall, they're getting much more intensive non-hospice hospital services and ED services and chemo. So I think the comment does align with the findings.
Yeah. And I think I would call our attention to that slide where it's the various it's a bar chart with the gray. And so that first one, 0 to 15 days or 1 to 15 days is gray, is mostly non-hospice before hospice spending. And that's definitely one of the factors, I think, for cancer patients, as you indicated. All right, we have another question. Do we have any data on hospice expense for those programs who admit folks who are still receiving curative or palliative or palliative treatment? And I'm going to go ahead and answer this question. We don't have that data at this point. So Brad, I'm so sorry. We have another question. How will this data be shared with CMS with the hope that they will stop their focus on length of stay and their aggressive penalty stance? And I think both NAC and NHPCO are pondering that question right now. So Bill and then Ben, do you want to answer that question?
Well, I mean, we do have some ongoing conversations regarding program integrity with CMS, and this does have a relationship to program integrity. So our next upcoming meeting with them would be the best time for us to share that with CMS, to integrate it into their thinking, along with the work that we've been doing with Congressman Blumenauer, who's focused a lot on the program integrity time too. So we know the doors are open for these conversations. And if I hazard a guess, I think that CMS would be very interested in hearing this. I don't think they'll come off as anything other than receptive.
Yeah. Right. And I think with the extension of the VBID demonstration project, over the next 5 years is going to be not only opportunity, but also a responsibility really to have that dialogue with CMS and CMMI particularly, and influencing it in that way.
All right, we have one, I believe we have one last question. It is important to be cautious about positioning these data as proof that hospice causes these differences in total cost of care. It is clear that people who use hospice are mostly less costly, but this is not a randomized controlled trial of the impact of hospice. A randomized controlled trial might show even bigger differences in cost savings. Can someone comment?
I can comment a little bit on that, Judy.
I was going to call on you, Davis. Go for it.
No worries. Yes, it was not an RCT in the traditional sense. It's very hard to do in a randomized controlled trial when you're doing a retrospective analysis on a huge claims data. That's not really the research framework that gets applied to an analysis like this. But NORC, as I mentioned before when we were going over the methodology, NORC did control for a number of potentially confounding variables. I listed a few of them: age, sex, number of chronic conditions. The really important one, which was novel to this technique, novel to this study, which is a new technique that hasn't been applied to hospice studies in the past, is that frailty index. And we know those other things, age, sex, number of chronic conditions, if you combine them all, they can kind of approximate to someone who's probably very ill or old. You know, if you're older, you're going to be sicker and so on. But the frailty index really looks at this really incredible mix of ICD-10 codes. So they're looking at all the things that get coded to these people, plus the procedure codes that are done to them, crunches it. And really, the inclusion of that gives us much more confidence that the non-hospice users, we compare to the hospice users, are very much alike. So what it approximates, the power of a randomized clinical trial in that sense of really, blinding the two studies. We just methodologically, we can't do a RCT on a huge claims analysis like this.
Right.
And I think one of the questions that we need to be answering too is, what do we do in our next generation of research in this area? I mean, this was an unprecedented effort that gives us a lot of information. And yes, we are in the land of overstatement when we're in Washington to begin with, but we are also in I think, of sound mind and thinking this is a first step in multiple generations of deep analysis and research relative to hospice.
And I guess I would say, as we are wrapping up, that this is not the end of our discussion with NORC, but just the beginning. So lots of other opportunities for us to take deeper dives on various components of the claims data we have and the claims data that we can look at moving forward. Carrie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Judy. And I would like to thank our faculty for this insightful presentation. And on behalf of the National Association for Home Care and Hospice and the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, thank you for participating in today's webinar. We are grateful for your time and the work that you do. And we want to hear from you and ask that each participant in today's webinar, please complete the evaluation. Your attendance and feedback is very important. The recording of today's webinar will be available by revisiting the registration link you used to access this webinar. That concludes our time together today. Thank you so much for joining us. We're wishing you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.